There came a moment in my life, a moment so quiet and yet so thunderous, that I can only describe it as the instant when the world blinked, and for the first time, I noticed the space between its eyelids. It happened without ceremony, without fanfare. I wasn't on a mountaintop or in a temple or sitting cross-legged in a perfect meditation posture. I was simply alive, breathing, existing. Yet something shifted so subtly at first that I almost missed it. The noise of the world, once so loud and insistent, began dissolving like smoke rising into a sky too vast to hold it, and I realized, almost with a sense of cosmic embarrassment, that I had lived most of my life obeying voices that were never mine. As I watched this invisible veil fall away, I felt as though I had just awakened from a dream I didn't know I was dreaming. I began to sense how deeply humanity performs for the invisible audience of its own imagination. We walk through life adjusting ourselves to expectations no one ever spoke aloud, trying to earn approval from people who are themselves too lost inside their own fears to notice. For years I had fed this phantom audience. I had polished my image, shaped my behavior, sculpted my identity like a fragile clay figure held up for inspection. And in that moment of awakening, I saw how absurd it all was. In my youth, fear was the teacher standing behind me, whispering lessons I mistook for truth. Fear of judgment, fear of failing, fear of becoming the misunderstood outsider in a world obsessed with conformity. I tried to fit into shapes that were never designed for my peculiar edges. I tried to soften parts of myself that were never meant to be softened. Every time I walked into a room, I wondered how I appeared through the eyes of others. Every word I spoke carried an echo of insecurity. I was an apprentice to fear, hoping one day it would grant me permission to be myself. But life has a strange way of rearranging the mind. Its lessons are not always dramatic. Sometimes they arrive gently, like a tide that shifts so slowly, you don't realize the shoreline has changed until you stand there barefoot, staring at unfamiliar sand. That is what happened to me. Something in me aged, not physically, but psychologically, and with that aging came a peculiar freedom. The judgment of the world, once sharp enough to wound me, began to feel like a dull whisper, and then, even stranger, it began to feel like an illusion entirely. I would look around and see how consumed people were by their own internal storms. Every person I encountered was a universe unto themselves, orbiting their insecurities, carrying unspoken fears, dreaming unspoken dreams. How could they possibly be judging me when their minds were so full of their own chaos? It was in realizing this that a door opened, quietly, almost reverently, into a new kind of freedom, a freedom not granted by society, but reclaimed from within. I began noticing small shifts. When I walked into a room, I no longer rehearsed my presence. I simply arrived. If I said something awkward, I didn't replay it for hours like a crime against humanity. If someone misunderstood me, I didn't fall apart trying to fix the misunderstanding. For the first time, I felt what it was like to breathe without the weight of invisible eyes pressing on my chest. The cage I had lived in dissolved, not because someone opened it, but because I realized it had always been made of thoughts, my thoughts. As this internal liberation unfolded, I discovered something deeper. Judgment had never been about other people. It had always been a reflection of my own fears. I feared being misunderstood because I didn't yet understand myself. I feared being judged because I hadn't yet learned to trust my own nature. And as these inner fears gently unraveled, I found myself standing in a vast open space within my own consciousness, space I didn't know existed, space uncluttered by the noise of expectation. I started to see the temporary nature of opinions, how quickly they shift, how little they matter, how fragile they are in the face of time. What someone praises you for today, they may forget tomorrow. What they criticize you for may disappear from their mind within minutes. The world is forgetful, fluid, distracted. And once I truly absorbed this, the grip of judgment loosened like a rope slipping from tired hands. I didn't need to carry the weight of what others thought, because their thoughts were never stable enough to build anything upon. This realization pulled me into a new authenticity. I began to speak more honestly, not to impress, not to charm, but simply because truth felt lighter than performance. I wore what felt comfortable rather than what felt socially acceptable. I acted from the core of my being instead of the edges shaped by expectation. And slowly, life began to feel like something I was participating in rather than performing in. This authenticity became a kind of quiet strength, a strength that didn't need to shout or prove or defend. It simply existed. And then something unexpected happened. The more I let go of judgment, the deeper my connection to others became. Without pretense, conversations turned sincere. Without insecurity, relationships became more effortless. Without the need to impress, I finally met people as myself. I discovered that vulnerability creates more bridges than perfection ever will. The world softened when I softened. It was as though the universe had been waiting for me to stop pretending. As I moved deeper into this experience, I noticed how life itself felt different. I began to see that existence was never meant to be lived under scrutiny. It was meant to be lived through exploration, mistakes, laughter, risks, and presence. And by releasing judgment, first the fear of receiving it, then the habit of giving it, my mind rediscovered a kind of innocence, the innocence of simply being. The innocence I had lost somewhere on the road to adulthood, somewhere in the labyrinth of trying to belong. And perhaps the most profound shift came when I realized how many burdens I had been carrying without knowing. Emotional weights, silent expectations. The invisible heaviness of trying to be the version of myself others preferred. I began setting these burdens down one by one, like stones taken out of my pockets after years of walking uphill. With every burden released, I felt myself becoming lighter. And the lighter I became, the clearer I saw. I discovered that not everything deserves my involvement, that not every conflict needs my energy, that not every problem has my name carved into it. I learned that some situations resolve themselves when I stop feeding them attention. I learned that responsibility does not mean carrying everything, it means choosing wisely what I carry. I learned that peace isn't found through control, but through release. And true release, is not an act of weakness. It is an act of clarity. It is the recognition that I do not need to fulfill every expectation, repair every broken thread, or hold every emotional weight handed to me. I began to understand that letting go is not abandoning life, it is honoring it. Honoring my limited time, my finite energy, my fragile humanity. Honoring the truth that I cannot become who I am meant to be if I am busy carrying who I no longer am. And so, quietly, without announcement, I began the slow and sacred process of returning to myself. I found myself moving through this inner returning as though walking through a familiar forest at dusk, where every step felt like a rediscovery of something I had misplaced long ago. The world around me had not changed, yet within me, entire landscapes were shifting. It felt as if I were watching myself from a quiet distance, observing how naturally I was beginning to shed layers that had clung to me for years. Layer after layer, habit after habit, belief after belief. And the more I watched this unraveling, the more I understood that most of what I thought was had simply been borrowed from the world. Now, for the first time, I was meeting the part of myself that had never been shaped by external hands. I started to recognize the difference between what truly belonged to me and what I had only carried because someone else once told me I should. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that authenticity isn't something learned, it is something remembered. Beneath every insecurity, beneath every layer of doubt, beneath every desire to please or impress, there had always been a voice, quiet, ancient, patient, waiting for me to stop running long enough to hear it. It was the voice of my own being, untouched by time, untouched by expectation. As I listened to this voice, I noticed how it spoke without fear. It did not ask permission. It did not apologize for existing. It simply expressed truth. And the more I listened, the more I realized how much of my suffering had come from ignoring this voice. Every time I silenced it to fit in, I felt something tighten inside me. Every time I hid it to avoid discomfort, something deep within dimmed just a little more. Life had been showing me the cost of self-abandonment long before I understood the lesson. With this awareness growing inside me, I felt as though I had stepped out of a fog that had covered my vision for years. Suddenly, I could see my past actions with undeniable clarity. I could see how often I had betrayed my own intuition just to maintain harmony. How often I had smiled when I wanted to speak. How often I had agreed when I wanted to resist. How often I had stayed silent simply because it was easier than confronting the truth. These realizations were not painful in the way I expected. They were liberating. They showed me that I wasn't flawed. I was simply uninformed about the depth of my own freedom. I realized that life becomes far more peaceful when I stop negotiating with myself. When I choose my truth over approval. When I choose integrity over comfort. When I choose authenticity over performance. And as this inner commitment deepened, an unusual strength began to grow inside me. It wasn't the loud, dramatic strength that needs to be seen or acknowledged. It was quiet, grounded, almost ancient. The kind of strength that stands effortlessly, without explanation. the kind of strength that cannot be taken away because it isn't borrowed from anyone. I started to understand that the true measure of maturity is not how well I can meet the expectations of the world, but how deeply I can listen to the truth inside me. And this truth, once awakened, becomes its own compass. It guides without demanding, it leads without forcing. It doesn't shout, it whispers. But its whispers are more powerful than the world's loudest voices. Once I began following this inner compass, I noticed that life, instead of becoming chaotic, began to align itself with surprising clarity. The things that no longer belonged to me quietly drifted away, while the things that resonated with my deeper nature naturally found their way into my path. I discovered that growth is not always a dramatic transformation. Sometimes it is simply the act of not repeating the same patterns that once held me back. Sometimes it is the decision to walk away from situations that drain me. Sometimes it is the choice to rest rather than push. Sometimes it is the courage to say no, even when saying yes would have been easier. And as I practiced these small acts of truth, a sense of inner spaciousness unfolded within me. It felt like breathing fresh air after years of inhaling dust. As my awareness expanded, I began recognizing how many people around me were living inside the same invisible cages I had lived in. Cages built from fear, from comparison, from inherited beliefs, from unspoken expectations. Each person carrying their silent suffering, convinced they had to carry it alone. I could see the heaviness in their eyes, the quiet exhaustion in their expressions, the tension in their bodies. And in seeing them, I saw my old self reflected back at me. It was then that I began to feel a profound compassion, not just for them, but for the version of myself who had struggled for so long without understanding why. I realized that judgment becomes impossible once I truly see the depth of human struggle. People do not act from wisdom, they act from wounds. They do not speak from clarity, they speak from confusion. They do not hurt others because they are strong, but because they are afraid. And knowing this allowed me to soften, not only toward others, but toward myself. I no longer demanded perfection from my past self. I no longer criticized the moments when fear guided my decisions. I understood now that growth is not linear, not predictable, not neat. It is wild, chaotic, and beautifully imperfect. With this expanded understanding, I began to notice subtle shifts in how I moved through the world. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. I no longer chased validation like a thirsty traveler running after mirages. I no longer carried guilt for choosing myself. Instead, I carried a silent confidence, a knowing that my life was my own to shape. This confidence didn't need recognition, it needed only alignment. And alignment, I found, happens naturally when I stop pretending. There were moments during this transformation when I felt an overwhelming sense of quiet. Not emptiness, but quiet, a deep, grounding stillness that felt like a return to something ancient within me. It was in this quiet that I realized how much noise I had been living with for years. Noise from the world, noise from my fears, noise from my thoughts. And as that noise faded, I discovered a deeper voice within me, steady, clear, unshaken. This was the voice of my own becoming. This state of being didn't require effort, it required honesty. It required the courage to see myself without filters, without excuses, without exaggerations. And the more I accepted what I saw, the more I understood that authenticity is not about becoming a better version of myself. It is about becoming the truest version of myself, a version that does not shrink, a version that does not perform, a version that does not hide in the shadows of doubt. And as this truth rooted itself deeper inside me, I felt my inner world expanding in ways I had never known possible. And as I moved forward into that widening sense of inner space, I realized that something inside me had begun to speak in a voice I had ignored for most of my life, a voice that wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but steady, ancient, and unbothered by the noise of the world. It told me that the real revolution I had been searching for wasn't happening out there in events, in victories, in achievements, or in the validation of others. It was happening inside the chambers of my own awareness, like a quiet unfolding I had never taken seriously. And when I finally allowed myself to listen, it felt as if the entire architecture of my mind shifted one click to the right, revealing a new door that had been waiting there the entire time. I walked through that door not physically, but through a shift in perception, and suddenly the world looked unfamiliar, not frightening, just new. I could feel myself shedding the old frameworks I had carried for years, the expectations, the fears, the borrowed beliefs. They began dissolving like mist evaporating from a warm stone. and I understood that the person I thought I needed to be was just a shadow costume stitched together by years of unconscious agreement with the world. But the being I truly am, the one underneath the mental noise, was something far older, far freer, far more mysterious. And when that realization settled, I felt a peculiar calm, a calm not gained from comfort, but from clarity. It was the kind of calm that arises when you finally stop fighting the wrong battles. The kind that appears when you finally understand that life was never asking you to outperform anyone. It was simply asking you to wake up. And in that wakefulness, I noticed the subtle movements of my own thoughts, how they tried to recreate old patterns, how they resisted change, how they clung to old fears like a child holding tight to a fading dream. But now I could see them clearly, and in seeing them, I was no longer controlled by them. I started paying attention to the space between my thoughts, the silent gap where something deeper resided. It didn't have language, but it had presence. It didn't offer explanations, but it offered direction. It didn't promise certainty, but it promised truth. And I realized that this inner place had been with me from the beginning, waiting patiently for me to slow down enough to notice it. This silent core of my being was untouched by failures, unaffected by praise, uninfluenced by fear. It was the part of me that never rushed, never panicked, and never doubted. And when I leaned into it, I felt myself aligning with something that felt ancient and cosmic. As I continued moving through this inner landscape, I felt a strange sense of expansion, as if my awareness was stretching beyond the confines of my personal story. The boundaries between my life and life itself began to blur. I sensed myself as part of a larger unfolding, a vast, interconnected dance that didn't depend on my success or failure to continue. And that recognition removed so much weight from my shoulders. I didn't have to be extraordinary. I didn't have to be perfect. I only had to be aware, because awareness itself is the source of transformation. And the more aware I became, the more I noticed the subtle illusions that shape our daily experience. How we mistake our thoughts for reality. How we project our fears onto neutral situations. How we imprison ourselves with narratives that were never ours to begin with. And I could see how I had lived in a mental echo chamber, hearing reflections of old patterns and confusing them for truth. But now I stood outside that chamber, finally able to see its walls, its mechanics, and its limits. I realized that most of the suffering I carried wasn't created by life. It was created by the stories I had attached to life. Stories about who I was supposed to be, what I should have achieved by now, what others expected from me. Stories built from comparison, disappointment, and misunderstanding. But when I stepped outside those stories, even for a moment, life itself felt lighter, clearer, more spacious. It felt like a canvas instead of a cage. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the author of my own experience. I walked further into that inner clarity and discovered something even more profound. Nothing in my past had the authority to define the direction of my future. Not the mistakes, not the regrets, not the moments I was ashamed of, not the times I felt lost. They were simply chapters, not verdicts, and as I accepted that truth, I felt the quiet return of a power I had forgotten I possessed. The power to choose, the power to create, the power to shift, the power to awaken. And behind all of that, there was an even deeper insight whispering through the silence. I am not the person I was yesterday. I am the possibility of who I can become next. When I allowed myself to fully feel that, the tension inside me dissolved. I no longer felt trapped in my own history. I felt like a river, always moving, always renewing, always reshaping the landscape of my life. And with that realization came an unexpected courage. Not the loud, heroic kind, but a quiet courage. The kind that rises from inner alignment rather than outer pressure. The courage to continue walking even when I didn't know the destination. The courage to trust my own evolution. The courage to allow myself to change. As I kept walking inward, I noticed how every fear, every insecurity, every doubt began to lose its grip when exposed to awareness. It's not that they disappeared, they simply stopped controlling me. They became small waves in a vast ocean instead of storms threatening to drown me. And I could sense that the more deeply I entered this inner space, the more life around me responded. Conversations felt different. Time felt different. My perception sharpened. My presence deepened. I wasn't observing life from the outside anymore. I was participating in it fully. The world around me hadn't changed, but I had. And because I changed, the meaning of everything shifted. I began to see beauty in places I had overlooked, wisdom in experiences I had dismissed, and opportunity in moments I once considered ordinary. Life began to feel strangely alive, as if it had been waiting for me to wake up and finally meet it. And I was meeting it not as the conditioned version of myself, but as something far more authentic, far more awake. As I moved onward, I felt myself entering a deeper layer of understanding. Not intellectual understanding, but experiential understanding, the kind that doesn't need words because it's lived, breathed, and felt. And within that understanding was a simple truth. The entire universe becomes accessible the moment you access yourself. And I kept walking deeper into that truth. And as I kept walking deeper into that truth, I felt an unmistakable shift happening within me, a shift so subtle at first that I could barely recognize it, yet so profound that it rewrote the texture of my awareness. It was as though the boundaries of my inner world were dissolving into something wider, something more fluid, something that didn't obey the rigid definitions my mind had spent years building. I could feel myself stepping into a dimension of perception that had always been here, just hidden behind the noise of my conditioned thoughts. The deeper I moved, the more the world around me felt like a mirror, reflecting not what it was, but what I was becoming. Every sensation, every feeling, every memory felt like a part of a larger design, as if life itself had been patiently arranging each moment, each challenge, each encounter to guide me toward this very threshold. And I realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, had been accidental. Even the darkest moments, the ones I wished I could erase, were glowing now with a strange kind of meaning, like fragments of a puzzle that finally began fitting together. As I stepped further into that awareness, I sensed a kind of inner alignment taking place, a sensing between the person I had been and the person I was becoming. The tension between my past and my potential began dissolving. The conflicts I carried no longer felt like obstacles, they felt like stepping stones in disguise. And in that realization, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. It was as though my very spirit exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. I noticed how the stories I once clung to, the hurts, the disappointments, the fears, were losing their weight. They were still part of me, but they no longer defined me. They became like echoes fading into distance, acknowledged but no longer commanding. And in their absence, something beautiful emerged, a deep, steady clarity, the kind that doesn't depend on certainty or perfection, but grows from the simple act of being present. I kept walking inward, and with each step I discovered more of myself. I saw the creativity I had suppressed, the intuition I had ignored, the freedom I had postponed. They were all waiting for me, untouched and unbroken. It felt like rediscovering pieces of my own soul that I had misplaced along the path of becoming who the world expected me to be. And as those pieces returned to me, I felt whole in a way I hadn't known was possible. Time seemed to stretch and soften around me as I moved deeper. The past felt less like a chain and more like a teacher. The future felt less like a thread and more like a canvas. And the present, this extraordinary, fragile, luminous present, became the center of everything. I realized that life only truly happens in this single moment, yet I had spent so much of my existence living everywhere except here. Now, standing in the rawness of the present, I felt as though I had finally returned home. The more I allowed myself to be here, fully here, the more I noticed an intelligence moving through my life. Not an external intelligence, but something internal, something woven into the fabric of my awareness. It guided me in silence, through intuition rather than logic, through feeling rather than thought. It wasn't loud. It didn't command. It simply pointed gently, unmistakably, toward the direction of my highest unfolding. As I followed that inner guidance, I felt increasingly aligned with a deeper rhythm, a rhythm that didn't rush, didn't demand, didn't fear. It was the rhythm of life itself, a rhythm I had been out of sync with for years. Now finally attuned to it, I felt myself moving with an ease, a grace, a flow I had forgotten was possible. Life began responding to me differently. Opportunities unfolded naturally. Insights appeared at just the right moment. Even challenges felt purposeful instead of chaotic. And as this inner unfolding continued, something even more profound began to dawn on me. I was not simply observing my transformation. I was participating in the transformation of life itself. My awakening wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger evolution, part of a collective rising, part of a consciousness discovering itself through the eyes of every human being who dares to wake up. I realized that every person is walking through their own inner landscape, carrying their own storms, searching for their own meaning. And in that recognition, I felt an immense compassion rise within me. Not a sentimental compassion, but a deep understanding that we are all fragments of the same mystery, all trying to remember who we truly are beneath the noise of the world. This understanding didn't distance me from others, it connected me to them in a way I had never felt before. As I kept moving through this realization, my inner world expanded even further. Thoughts felt less like chains and more like clouds drifting through a boundless sky. Emotions felt less like burdens and more like messages from a deeper intelligence. And the ego, the familiar narrator inside my mind, felt less like an enemy and more like a frightened child who had simply been trying to protect me in the only way it knew how. I held that part of myself with a gentleness I didn't know I possessed. I let it soften, I let it relax. And in that softening, my inner space widened even more. I could feel layers of tension dissolving, layers I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My body felt lighter, my mind clearer, my awareness sharper. I felt as though I had stepped into the deepest version of myself. But this journey didn't lead me into isolation, it led me toward connection. The more I discovered within myself, the more I felt connected to everything outside myself. The trees, the sky, the people, the moments, everything felt alive with meaning. Everything felt part of the same fabric. And I sensed that the universe wasn't speaking to me through words, but through synchronicities, sensations, intuitions, subtle alignments that became impossible to ignore. It became clear to me that the universe wasn't distant, wasn't indifferent, it was responsive. It was interactive, it was conscious. And I understood that awareness isn't something we possess, it's something we participate in. We are not observers of the universe, we are expressions of it. And the moment I understood this, I no longer felt alone, not for a single breath. As I kept walking through this awareness, I realized that the ultimate transformation wasn't happening in my thoughts or beliefs. It was happening in my perception of reality itself. I saw that life wasn't a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. I saw that meaning wasn't something to find, but something to create. And I understood that purpose wasn't hidden somewhere far away, it was embedded in every conscious choice I made. The deeper I breathed into this truth, the more I realized that freedom had never been outside me. It had always been within me, waiting for me to stop escaping, stop resisting, stop running from myself. Freedom wasn't the absence of challenges. It was the presence of awareness. It was the ability to experience life fully without being imprisoned by it. It was the power to choose my response even when I couldn't choose my circumstances. And as this understanding integrated into me, something remarkable happened. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for something specific, but for everything. For the journey, for the struggles, for the lessons, for the evolution, for the simple miracle of consciousness itself. Gratitude didn't feel like a practice, it felt like a state of being. And in that state, everything around me seemed illuminated with a quiet brilliance. The longer I stayed in this inner light, the more a final truth began rising within me, slow, steady, undeniable. A truth that carried the weight of ancient wisdom and the softness of a whispered secret. And when it finally took shape inside my awareness, I felt my entire being resonate with it. The journey I had been walking was not leading me somewhere, it was leading me back to myself. Not the old self, not the conditioned self, but the self that exists beneath thought, beneath fear, beneath identity, the self that is woven from consciousness itself. And as that truth settled, everything inside me aligned. Every question I once struggled with, every doubt that once shook me, every fear that once controlled me, every memory that once defined me, all of them became part of a larger understanding, a realization that the meaning of life is not hidden in the world. It is unveiled through the expansion of awareness. That growth doesn't come from chasing a destiny outside ourselves, but from awakening the destiny within us. That purpose isn't something we find, it's something we remember, and that the greatest journey any human being can make is the journey inward. Because when we truly meet ourselves, everything changes. The world looks different, time feels different, people appear different, even breathing feels different. And in that difference, we discover the single truth that anchors everything. Everything we seek, peace, clarity, meaning, purpose, freedom, does not come from life. It comes from consciousness meeting life with awareness. And when I understood that, when I truly felt it resonate through every layer of my being, I realized that the awakening I had been waiting for was already happening. I wasn't becoming something new. I was remembering something eternal. And in that remembrance, I finally understood the conclusion to this entire journey. The most powerful transformation is not becoming more, it is becoming aware, not escaping the world, but waking up within it. Not finding yourself, but returning to the you that has been here all along. And with that realization, I stepped into a new chapter of my existence, not because life had changed, but because I had awakened to the extraordinary depth hidden beneath the ordinary moments of being alive.